Right now, somewhere in the Baltic Sea, a 12-story floating shopping mall is crossing an invisible line in the water. The people on board do not feel it. Nobody announces it. But the moment that ship crosses that line, something remarkable happens. They are no longer in the European Union. They have not left Finland. They have not reached international waters. The captain has not veered off course. They have simply passed a set of GPS coordinates surrounding a small collection of islands. And in doing so, every single passenger on that ship is now legally entitled to buy alcohol, perfume, cigarettes, and electronics without paying EU tax. They will do this for approximately 45 minutes. Then the ship will move on. They will re-enter the EU. Their bags will be full, and no rule will have been broken. That invisible line surrounds the Åland Islands, a Swedish-speaking autonomous archipelago of roughly 30,000 people sitting in Finnish territory, halfway between Helsinki and Stockholm. And if you think that sounds like a minor geographical oddity, you're about to understand why the European Union has, for 30 years, been unable to do anything about it. This is not a story about a tax loophole. It is about how a demilitarized island chain, born from a 19th century war, weaponized its own vulnerability to negotiate permanent exemption from the world's most powerful trading bloc, and then got rich doing it. And once you understand how they did it, you will never look at the EU's unified market the same way again. Meet the harmonizer. The harmonizer works in Brussels. He's been working in Brussels since 1995. He believes sincerely and with religious conviction that the European Union's single market is a masterpiece of human cooperation. One set of rules, no exceptions, clean, efficient, universally applied. He has dedicated his career to stamping out tax discrepancies between member states. He writes memos about fiscal harmonization. He gives presentations with pie charts. He sleeps soundly. The Åland Islands are the reason the harmonizer has not had a full night of sleep in 30 years. Here is the rule that most people quietly assume applies everywhere in the EU. When you travel between two EU countries, say, from Finland to Sweden, you cannot buy goods duty-free. The EU abolished intra-EU duty-free sales in 1999. One market, one tax zone, no loopholes, clean, harmonized. The harmonizer was pleased. But when you audit the underlying data, you will find something the pie charts do not include. There is a footnote. In the Treaty of Finland's accession to the European Union, Protocol 2, there is a clause. It states that the Åland Islands are excluded from the application of EU VAT and excise duty directives. This means Åland is legally treated as a third country for tax purposes, not a Finnish territory, not an EU territory, a third country, like Japan, like Canada, like somewhere that has simply never heard of Brussels. So, when a ferry travelling from Helsinki to Stockholm stops at Mariehamn, the capital of Åland, it technically leaves the EU, and then it re-enters the EU. And in that window, while the ship is docked at a small harbour on a Baltic archipelago best known for apple orchards and red wooden cabins, the passengers can shop, not browse, shop, at prices that reflect zero EU excise duty on alcohol, tobacco and perfume. The harmonizer made a cup of tea, sat down with this protocol and understood that the entire architecture of EU fiscal harmonization had a 1,580 square kilometre hole in it. But wait, it gets worse, because this was not a loophole that someone slipped in by accident. This was a demand. To understand why the EU gave Åland a permanent tax exemption, you have to understand why Finland gave Åland permanent autonomy. And to understand that, you have to go back to a war that most people only remember because of Florence Nightingale. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856. Åland had been part of the Russian Empire since 1809, when Sweden was forced to hand over Finland after a military defeat. Russia, being Russia, immediately saw the strategic potential of this archipelago sitting at the entrance to the Gulf of Bothnia and began building a massive fortress on the islands. The British and French, who were fighting Russia in the Crimea, were less than delighted about this. In 1854, their naval forces sailed north, bombarded the fortress of Bomasund, and destroyed it. The war ended in 1856. In the Treaty of Paris, Russia agreed to demilitarize the Åland Islands permanently. No military installations, no fortifications, no armed presence. Now fast forward to 1917. Finland declares independence from Russia. The population of Åland, who are Swedish-speaking and have always identified culturally with Sweden, immediately petitioned to rejoin Sweden. In a 1919 referendum, 9,900 of the 10,000 voters said yes to Sweden. Sweden was pleased, Finland was not. The dispute went to the newly formed League of Nations, which in June 1921 delivered its verdict. Åland would remain under Finnish sovereignty, but Finland had to guarantee the islands their Swedish language, Swedish culture, complete political autonomy, and the continuation of demilitarized neutral status. Think about what that means. Åland is Finnish soil, but Finland cannot station a single soldier there. Finland cannot build barracks there. The residents do not serve in the Finnish military. The islands have been legally defenceless for over 160 years. In return, Åland received something far more powerful than an army. It received a veto. Under the Autonomy Act, Finland cannot apply international treaties to Åland without the consent of the Åland Parliament. When Finland applied to join the European Union in 1992, the Åland Parliament had to separately vote on membership. And here is the thing about having 30,000 people, your own parliament, a legal veto, and a history of everyone around you underestimating you. You negotiate. It is 1994. Finland is negotiating EU membership. The process is moving, deadlines are looming, and then, from a group of small islands with a population roughly equal to a medium-sized suburb, comes a condition. We want out of the EU's tax zone, permanently. The harmonizer, who was just starting his career in 1994, heard this and felt something new. Confusion. You want to join the European Union, but not the part where the EU applies? Yes, said Åland. Specifically, the tax-free ferry trade is the economic lifeblood of these islands. The EU plans to abolish duty-free sales on intra-EU routes in 1999. If that abolition applies to ferries passing through Åland, the entire shipping economy of the islands collapses. So either we get an exemption, or we vote no to Finnish EU membership. And if we vote no, Finland's accession treaty requires our consent, which means Finland has a problem. Now you might be thinking, Finland is a sovereign nation. Surely Finland could just overrule a small autonomous region and tell Brussels to ignore their demands. Wrong. The 1991 Autonomy Act is constitutionally embedded. Finland cannot override the Åland Parliament on matters touching its autonomy, and it is not in Finland's interest to try. The Finnish shipping industry runs through Åland ports. Viking Line, one of the largest ferry operators in the world, is headquartered in Mariehamn, Åland's capital. The ferry routes connecting Helsinki and Turku to Stockholm are a critical economic artery for Finland itself. The deeper you look, the more troubling it becomes. Finland needed Åland to say yes. Brussels needed Finland to say yes. Åland knew both of these things. The result was Protocol 2, attached to Finland's Treaty of Accession, ratified in 1994. the Åland Islands became the only territory in the European Union with a permanent treaty-level exemption from EU VAT and excise duty directives. In EU legal terms, Åland is a third territory for taxation purposes. Goods crossing the tax border between Åland and mainland Finland are subject to export and import declarations, the same customs paperwork you would file when trading with South Korea, for a ferry ride of 160 kilometres. The harmoniser updated his pie chart. He added a small, unmarked exception at the bottom. It has been there ever since. If this already feels like something that should not be possible, drop a comment below, because we are just getting started. The harmoniser has now been told that the tax exemption exists. He finds it irritating but manageable. It is a single small island. How much economic distortion can 30,000 people really create? Let's look at the numbers. Shipping accounts for approximately 40% of Åland's entire economy. Not 40% of the tourism sector. Not 40% of trade. 40% of the total GDP of the region. That is an extraordinary concentration for an economy that consists largely of small businesses, farms, and fishing operations. Let me make the abstract concrete. Imagine if 40% of the economy of New York was derived from one activity tied to a geographical quirk in maritime law. That is roughly the scale we're dealing with, adjusted for population size. Viking Line, founded in 1959 by a group of Åland businessmen, is headquartered in Mariehamn. Its ships, recognisable by their bright red hulls, run the Stockholm-Turku and Stockholm-Helsinki routes, stopping at Åland in both directions on every crossing. Tallink Silja, the other dominant Baltic operator, does the same. The stop at Mariehamn or Långnäs is not a scenic detour. It is a legal necessity for the business model. Without the Åland stop, these ships are operating entirely within the EU tax zone. Duty-free sales are illegal. The onboard shops go dark. And the economics of the crossing, which rely heavily on retail margin from perfume counters and alcohol sections, collapse. The EU abolished intra-EU duty-free sales in 1999 for all other routes. The Stockholm-Tallinn route, which does not stop at Åland, lost its duty-free status. The Stockholm-Helsinki and Stockholm-Turku routes kept it. The ferries on those routes continued to run 12-storey floating department stores at full profit. The ferries that did not have an Åland stop found themselves economically disadvantaged overnight. The visible issue distracts from the real damage. The real consequence of Protocol 2 is not that passengers can buy cheap gin. It is that every single major Baltic Sea ferry route that is economically viable must stop at Åland. Not because of the scenery, because of the tax border. The harmoniser is now writing a longer memo. His section on geographic externalities is getting quite detailed. In 2006, Eurostat ranked Åland the 20th wealthiest region in the entire European Union, out of 268 regions. GDP per person was 47% above the EU average, not 5% above, not 15% above, 47%. This is a collection of islands with no mineral resources, no major manufacturing sector, and a total population smaller than many EU suburbs. In 2010, Åland residents paid 0.7% of all taxes collected in Finland. Åland's population is 0.54% of Finland's total. That means Åland was fiscally overperforming relative to its population share, to a degree that triggered what the Finnish government calls, without any apparent irony, diligence money, a bonus payment from Helsinki to Mariehamn for contributing more than the expected 0.5% of national revenue. An autonomous archipelago that negotiated a permanent tax exemption from Brussels is so economically productive that it regularly sends a financial surplus back to the mainland government that technically governs it. The island that should have been a drain on the Finnish budget is subsidising Finnish tax receipts. The story we have always been told about tax havens and exemptions goes like this. One entity games the rules, others subsidise the gap, everyone loses. But when you audit the underlying data in Åland's case, that story falls apart. The exemption did not drain the economy, it became the economy. The zero VAT status turned a remote archipelago into the economic address of choice for the Baltic shipping industry. The shipping industry paid wages, the wages were taxed, the property market grew, the service sector expanded, and Finland, which had theoretically given away a tax advantage, received more revenue from those islands than it would have if the ferry model had simply collapsed in 1999. And now, the harmonizer is no longer writing memos. He is sitting at his desk, staring at the pie chart, and quietly wondering if the exception is, in some non-trivial sense, better than the rule. He will not say this out loud. He will not put it in the memo, but he is thinking it. You might think the solution is to simply let this continue indefinitely. Wrong. The Åland model is facing the kind of threats that do not arrive with a press release. They arrive slowly, structurally, through mechanisms that have nothing to do with the original loophole. The first threat is Estonia. When Estonia joined the EU in 2004, it brought with it alcohol prices significantly lower than those in Finland or Sweden. Suddenly, the Helsinki-Tallinn route became the destination of choice for passengers who wanted cheap spirits. The Tallink ships covering that route did not stop at Åland, but Estonia's low domestic taxes created a parallel duty-free economy that competed directly with the Åland ferry model. In 2004, Finland was forced to dramatically cut its own domestic alcohol tax to stop Finns from making day trips to Tallinn, purely to fill their cars with beer. So the economy that Åland had protected with a legal carve-out in 1995 was now being squeezed by a different country's internal price structure. The further you rely on a single legal exception, the more fragile the exception becomes when the world around it changes. The second threat is the one the harmonizer has been quietly preparing for 20 years. Environmental regulation. The EU's push to reduce emissions from shipping is accelerating. Carbon pricing schemes, tightening sulfur restrictions, and the potential extension of the EU emissions trading system to maritime transport are all applying structural cost pressure to the Baltic ferry model. Ships that stop at Åland are large, fuel-intensive vessels designed around a retail profit model. If the environmental cost per passenger mile rises sharply, the economics of 12-storey floating shopping malls become harder to justify. Viking Line has already committed to a green maritime corridor between Turku and Stockholm, targeting carbon neutrality by 2035. The third threat is the most subtle. It is the question of whether Åland can hold its position inside a treaty architecture that is increasingly under pressure from multiple directions. The EU has shown, with Brexit and various other disputes, that treaty language is more durable than individual political will. Protocol 2 is not going away. But the economic relevance of what Protocol 2 protects may shift over time as digital commerce replaces physical retail and as the psychology of duty-free shopping as a reason to travel fades with generations. The harmonizer at this point is no longer writing memos about Åland. He has concluded that Åland won, that the exception became so embedded in the operational logic of Baltic shipping that removing it would require dismantling a multi-billion euro industry structure. He has moved on to other projects, but he keeps the pie chart, the one with the unmarked exception at the bottom. He looks at it sometimes, so let's recap what actually happened here. First, Åland lost a war it was not fighting. The Crimean War demilitarized the islands in 1856, leaving them legally defenseless for nearly 2 centuries. Then, Åland lost a referendum it held in 1919. 9,900 people voted to join Sweden. The League of Nations said no. Then, Åland lost sovereignty, declared part of Finland despite the population's explicit objection. And then, from a position of having lost every conventional form of power available to it, Åland found an unconventional one, a constitutional veto, a unique legal status, and an EU accession negotiation that arrived at exactly the right moment. The Åland Islands did not outsmart the European Union with clever lawyers or aggressive lobbying. They outsmarted it by being exactly what they had always been: a demilitarized, autonomous, Swedish-speaking archipelago whose legal identity had been constructed piece by piece across 160 years of being disputed by larger powers. Every treaty that tried to limit them gave them another layer of protection. Every political settlement that seemed to constrain them embedded a right that later became leverage. By the time Brussels arrived with its harmonization agenda, Åland was not a problem to be solved. It was a condition that already existed. The lesson here is not that small places can exploit legal technicalities. That is too simple. The lesson is that identity, culture, and historical continuity, things that look like soft, sentimental issues in economic negotiations, can become the hardest currency in the room. The Åland Protocol exists not because of sharp negotiating tactics, but because a community of 30,000 people had spent a century saying clearly and consistently, "This is who we are. This is what we need." And those claims, over time, became legally embedded, constitutionally protected, and finally, treaty level. The European Union built a single market on the principle that no part of Europe should operate by a different set of rules, and then it signed a treaty that guaranteed exactly that to a collection of islands that had never asked to be part of the arrangement in the first place. Åland is not a tax haven. It is not a loophole. It is the accumulated weight of history, pressing down on a single footnote in a treaty that Brussels would very much prefer you had not read. Go read it. If this video changed how you think about EU sovereignty, small autonomous regions, or the idea that unified rules actually means uniform rules, hit the like button. It genuinely helps the channel reach people who would never search for Åland but absolutely need to know it exists. Subscribe if you want more videos on the places, mechanisms, and forgotten treaties that explain how the modern economic world actually works. Not how it claims to work, how it actually works. And I want to hear from you in the comments. What other places have done something similar? What other communities have used historical accident, legal status, or geographical quirk to carve out an economic position that the surrounding system cannot touch? I will be reading.